companies don't lose deals because of competition. They lose deals because something in the buyer's process is broken. Deel understood that before everyone else. Hi, I'm Fluman, founder of Match B2B. With me are Dafna Cohen, who specializes in international go-to-market strategy and market entry, and Nadav Berkovich, who specializes in global sales execution, SDR systems, and AI-enabled revenue processes. Welcome to GTM Moves, a series where we break down one real go-to-market decision and the lesson you can apply this week. Deel didn't grow by selling payroll software. They grew by removing the single biggest barrier to global hiring, legal complexity.
And that phrase, legal complexity, is the whole story. A few years ago, hiring someone in another country was not a simple HR task. It meant entity setup, local counsel, tax questions, employment classification, benefits, contracts, and every step added friction. That friction was not theoretical. It slowed revenue speed. If a sales leader wanted to hire an SDR in Germany or an AE in Brazil, the real question was not, do we have the software? It was, can we do this without waiting months, breaking local law, or coordinating 5 different vendors? That is the GTM move. Not a nicer HR tool, not better payroll UX. The move was to identify the real blocker in the buying decision and build the company narrative around removing it. In Deel's case, the blocker was not paying people. Companies have always found ways to pay people. The blocker was hiring globally without legal exposure.
When remote work accelerated, that pain became urgent. Companies suddenly needed talent in multiple countries, but the old hiring process was slow, fragmented, and risky. Deel's advantage was timing, but timing alone is not enough. They won because they turned a compliance problem into a simple operational flow. Before Deel, global hiring meant legal setup, local vendors, delays, and risk. After Deel, you select a candidate, generate a compliant contract, onboard, and pay in one workflow. That shift matters because it removes decision friction. Buyers do not want another dashboard. They want the ability to act without creating a legal and operational mess.
Exactly. That is the GTM move. Not, we built a nicer HR tool. Not, we modernized payroll UX. The move was to identify the real blocker in the buying decision, then build the company narrative around removing it. In Deel's case, that blocker was legal exposure in global hiring.
And the timing matters. If Deel had said this before distributed work became urgent, the message would have sounded useful but not essential. But once remote work accelerated, especially around 2020, this became board-level urgency. Suddenly, companies were hiring across borders because they wanted talent, speed, and cost flexibility, not because it was some nice experiment.
Let me sharpen that. Around 2020, global hiring stopped being an exception and became an operating model. So the pain wasn't how do I manage payroll better? It was how do I hire in 20, 50, maybe 100 countries without building legal infrastructure in each one. That's a very different buyer psychology.
So the question for you is simple. What is the real barrier your product removes? Because if you can name that barrier clearly, you can sharpen your positioning, improve your outbound, and build a stronger enterprise sales motion around it. If you want help identifying that barrier in your market and turning it into a clearer GTM system, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Fluman, Match B2B.
I like this because it exposes a classic B2B trap. Teams describe the category they're in instead of the constraint they remove. We do payroll, we do workflow, we do analytics. Fine. But the buyer is asking one thing. What painful thing disappears if I choose you?
And to be very clear, that answer is worth remembering. Deel didn't grow by selling payroll software. They grew by removing the single biggest barrier to global hiring, legal complexity. Make the buyer journey visual. Before Deel, hiring globally meant legal setup, local vendors, delays, and risk. After Deel, select a candidate, generate a compliant contract, onboard, and pay in one workflow. That is category-level compression of complexity.
Legal setup, local vendors, delays, and risk. Those four things are brutal together because each one creates a different bottleneck. Legal setup kills speed. Local vendors create fragmentation. Delays wreck hiring momentum. And risk? Risk is the one that makes finance and legal step in and say, no, we're not doing this yet.
And once finance and legal say not yet, the whole commercial plan slips. This is why I don't see Deel as a convenience product. It changed operational sequencing. Instead of building international hiring infrastructure country by country, the buyer could access a system that made expansion feel executable.
That's an important distinction. Great GTM is not only about making a process easier. Sometimes it's about making a process possible.
And the scale numbers matter because they tell you this message wasn't clever copywriting. By 2023, Deel crossed $500 million in ARR and operates in over 150 countries. That is not trivia. That is proof that the barrier was real, urgent, and widely shared.
Over 150 countries is a specific number that lands for me, because when a buyer hears 150 countries, they don't hear feature breadth. They hear reduced uncertainty. They hear, maybe I don't need a different patchwork for France, Mexico, the UAE, and Singapore.
If the product removes a structural barrier, legal complexity and global hiring, adoption can move faster because the value is tied directly to expansion.
Though I think there's a trap here. Founders hear this and say, great, so I should talk about pain. No, not generic pain. Specific blocked motion. Deel didn't say HR is hard. They said effectively, hiring across borders breaks on compliance, entities, contracts, and payment coordination. We collapse that into one operating workflow.
Yes, that's the difference between messaging and positioning. Messaging describes, positioning assigns meaning. Payroll platform describes. We remove the legal barrier to global hiring, assign strategic meaning the buyer can act on.
And that's the repeatable lesson. Deel won by framing itself around the barrier it removed, not the interface it shipped. So what should a B2B leader do with this? Start here. Your market does not buy features first. It buys the removal of a constraint. If your outbound team is struggling, if enterprise deals stall, if your positioning sounds fine but pipeline quality is inconsistent, ask one hard question. What is the actual barrier your buyer is trying to remove?
And in outbound, this is huge because weak outbound usually start with category language. We help automate X. We improve visibility into Y. Fine, but nobody replies to that. They reply when you identify the thing blocking motion: qualified hiring, territory expansion, compliance approval, data quality, handoff speed. That's what gets meetings.
In enterprise sales too, the same logic holds. Large deals rarely close because a buyer liked a feature list. They close because the organization agrees that one barrier is expensive enough, risky enough, or strategic enough to solve now. If you can't name that barrier clearly, marketing creates activity, but sales inherits ambiguity.
Exactly. Companies do not win by messaging features better. They win by identifying the real barrier their product removes and building the GTM system around it. Positioning, outbound, proof points, sales narrative, and onboarding.
Not payroll software, barrier removal. That's sticky. I'm going to remember that line.
I will too, because it forces discipline. It asks, are we selling a tool, or are we removing the thing that keeps the buyer from moving?
That's the question. What is the real barrier your product removes? Because if you can name that barrier clearly, your entire go-to market changes, from positioning to outbound to enterprise sales. If you want help identifying the real barrier in your market and translating it into a stronger GTM system, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Benny Fluman from Match B2B. We help companies build the system around what actually moves revenue. See you in the next GTM move.